There comes a time in the development of every family when the children begin to ask questions. And one of the questions that can be looked forward to with some apprehension is the inevitable one: where did I come from? Family braces for this, and according to its own insight and its estimation of the intelligence of the child, attempts to explain the origin of life. First of all, of course, the child is asked, where did I come from? This is always overlooked, for there is no ready and available answer. The parents, if they are modern and feel that they cannot expose their children to legendary, attempt a simple statement of biology. The best they can possibly hope to accomplish, with or without the aid of the birds and the bees, is a description of some kind relative to the origin of the physical body of that child. Because the youngster has no particular point in mind when he asks the question, usually merely interested in larger generalities, the child does not normally question further. He accepts an answer that is obviously inadequate because he has no way of estimating adequacy. The matter then rests for a time and may not be brought up again for 50 or 60 years. The information that has been provided is regarded as gospel, and later various courses in school and college support this position. There are remote ancestors back in the days when they were trying to orient themselves in this universe in which we live. They're a little more thoughtful, or a little more idealistic in their approach to this large issue. In order to understand where we come from, you have to find out where the world came from. You have to understand the entire process of creation itself. For only against the background of a great universal law or pattern can the development of individual forms of life be properly considered. From the most ancient times, therefore, we may say that concepts concerning the origin of things, the origin of existence itself, divided into two general patterns. These patterns have descended to us in philosophy, religion, science, and we are still clinging to some aspect of this ancient thinking, although we have attempted to enlarge and deepen our understanding. There are only two ways in which you can answer the question of first cause. One is to take the attitude that there was a beginning of some kind. No matter how you try to work with this situation, it is embarrassing. If, for example, you imagine the child asking questions to be a little older and a little wiser, and you tell that child that he came from his parents, then the next question would be, where did the parents come from? They came from their parents, and so on by regression to one inevitable point of uncertainty. Where did the primordial, original, first parents come from? This question is still not answered, and is not likely to be, except by further regression of thinking. Some scientists might point out that we came from the anthropoids. Then the question is, where did the anthropoids come from? Then we can go back through all the different forms of life to a monocellular organism sometime in the dawn of things, but we are still burdened with the question, where did that come from? Therefore, all questions concerning beginning have to be approached non-logically. You cannot possibly develop a logical sequence that will include the origin of first cause. The theological approach to this in several different areas has been to assume that creation was created by a divine being. This is probably the ultimate theological regression. It is as far back as even the most pious-minded can think. We must then assume that apart from creation, there was a creator, and that for some reason, at a certain time, long ago, or not so long ago, according to the denomination you belong to, this creator caused by his own will or by the verbum, the speaking of the ineffable word, to cause the world to come forth. Here we have then a creator separate from creation, ordaining it, creating it, fashioning it, dominating, governing, and ruling it, and planning its progress over a period of time. Obviously, this pattern nearly always includes an ultimate dissolution of this world. It returns at some infinite time in the future to the unknowable being from which it came. We seem to have a rather neat package here, except for one difficulty. Where did God come from? What was the nature of this being? Was this being ever existing? The only answer that seems to be possible is, therefore, that it was ever existing. For it is almost inconceivable to man to imagine God growing up from a small child. We are confronted then with deity as an unknowable value, an inevitable and ultimate value, beyond which we cannot go. What constitutes the nature of the divine? What is the basic power of the divine consciousness? Theologians do not like to discuss. It gets to be too complicated, and we are not in the presence of any satisfactory formal knowledge which can withstand the debates of opposing opinions. The second theory, or philosophy that has been fashioned, simply frankly assumes that what we might term the infinite essence or infinite nature of things is by its own quality and principle eternal. That everything that it does is in essence eternal, and that what we call creation is merely a manifestation, a conditioned existence arising within an eternal nature. According to this concept, creation is not the result of the dictum of an arbitrary or separate deity. Creation is a manifestation of principles that are inherent within existence itself, existence being eternal and inevitable. This attitude, this conviction, I think, held most of the better minds of the past. That at the beginning, root, or substance of all conditioned existence, as we can imagine it, whether of human beings or of suns or of solar systems or of galaxies or of cosmic change, even of space itself, at the root and source of all of this is essence, an unconditioned nature of itself, capable of manifesting condition, but always containing within its own ineffable principle all that can be manifested from it. Thus we may say that existence moves into the production of existences, and these existences return again to existence, which continues. It was interesting to realize that some rather ancient peoples, long before the benefits of knowledge as we have them today, were able to conceive of this total existence, to conceive that it transcended time. The time was merely an expression of it, that it transcended space. Space was only a manifestation of it, and that there exists somewhere, everywhere, in the innermost and outermost parts of all things, and in all the intervals between the innermost and the outermost, one indivisible essence, one indivisible being, and that this continuing forever is the base material, the earth in which creation grows, and that creation itself is merely a continuing process in which the potentials of this infinite existence are gradually transformed into potencies or manifestations. Today, I believe the tendency is to assume this general concept. In the development of this concept, of course, many systems of philosophy lost sight of the idea of an ultimate deity. They lost sight of the concept of one conscious being at the source of life. Rather, they thought of an eternal being, all conscious, always, and that consciousness as we know it is as much a conditioned state of universal consciousness as bodies as we know them are conditioned states of universal substance. This general attitude seemed to provide the best foundation for the creation of a philosophic system. For systems has to be born just as beings are born, out of a primary conviction. And the primary conviction becomes the essence of that doctrine or that philosophy, which merely expands and extends it. We may term the primary conviction a premise or an hypothesis, but upon it must be built all that follows after it in terms of the detailed explanation of the processes of creation. Out of the general opinion and substance of many ancient systems, we can gain a certain basic idea of the beginnings of human thought in these matters. In both East and West, in the most ancient cultural concepts, we find, therefore, that, so to say, in the beginning, or from the beginning, or however we want to call it, throughout eternity, from that which has no beginning or end as we know it, but beginning now in the sense of fundamental, basic, that which is the source of all else, that in this kind of a beginning there was an infinite essence, infinitely diversified, spreading through all time and space as a great principle of life. That this life principle transformed what might be termed vacuum into a dynamic space area or field. This field is limitless, eternal, inevitable, and it extends not only beyond the stars as we see them, but beyond all creations of all kinds, beyond even our imagination. This is one potency, one tremendous dynamic. And this dynamic is invisible to us, beyond our comprehension, has no form or shadow by which we can see it, and in its natural and inevitable state is not even imaginable by us. Consequently, we cannot define this nature. We can only accept, in terms of thoughts or in terms of words, that there is this unconditioned eternal, and that in some mysterious way, this is the cause that existence as we know it can exist. Existence can exist only because life exists. And life itself is one of the basic manifestations of space, of eternity. And it causes from its own nature all the living things that are dependent upon life for their existence. So we can either consider the ancient writings of the Zohar, the Kabbalah of the early Jews, or the ancient Vedic writings and particularly the Puranas of the Hindus, or the I Ching, the classic of change, the ancient book of China, or any one of many other early records. They all seemingly have admitted the same essential principle, that there was an eternity, and that this eternity is the principle which peoples and nations have gradually come to identify as God. God, therefore, is primarily abstractly the mysterious unity of eternal life. Deity is the one that permeates all. It is the one undifferentiated. It is that which is one in sense of total unity. And from this inevitable and ineffable source, all things originate. Now this would cause naturally a consideration of what the Gnosis and the Kabbalists call the doctrine of emanations. Here we have something that goes on like a great ocean, Tao in China. Here is the great sea, the inevitable. We watch it in our mind's eye because we cannot see it, but we can imagine it as though it were a vast ocean extending through all eternity. And it is quiet, and it seems to be unmoved. And yet somewhere in the apparently transparent depths of it, there has to be things, seeds, lives, principles, energies, essences. And these are capable of coming forth out of this procedure under certain conditions. We then come to the problem of conditions. And this again forces us back into the idea of how it all started. How did this eternal potential suddenly, dynamically come degenerate? How did this sea, which is forever itself, suddenly cause something to arise within it, which seems to be a diminution of itself? Two principles are involved in the solution to this. The first is that this vast ocean of potential was also forever creating, that the process of creation is as eternal as the principle itself. Therefore, no matter how far you want to go back in your imagination, the creating process was already in operation. There was no time when this wheel suddenly started to turn. It has always turned. For what we might regard as this the first impulse, the first movement of things, is an eternal movement, first again in quality rather than in time. Consequently, space or eternity or essence was forever producing from itself, production being an essential part of its eternal nature. The other point of view is that this God concept produced an infinite descent or generation of beings, divine beings, who use space as the raw material for the creation of universes and cosmic systems, created by their will and purpose. And that this chain of descending beings is also eternal, that it never began and it never will end, but that there is in this space itself, as part of its own nature, an eternal descent of creators. The part of space's own structure is created consciousness, which manifests automatically and continuously forever. Well, for people who did not know anything about modern thinking in astronomy and physics and all these subjects, this was pretty profound reasoning. But as we study it more carefully, we begin to appreciate some of the validity of this pattern. That universes come and go, worlds are fashioned as men are fashioned, and disappear again as men disappear. But as the passing of the individual has no permanent effect upon the unfoldment of humanity as a collective, so the passing of 1,000 solar systems has no effect upon the eternal movement or eternal unfoldment in space itself. Space is ever begetting, ever producing, and gradually the forms which it engenders disappear back again in their fatigue or exhaustion into the principles which created them. In the Indian philosophy, we have an interesting sidelight on this point. For in Indian thinking, creation is not only this continuous production, but it is dominated by a law of periodicity. The so-called creating powers do not create continuously. They create for a certain length of time, and then the creating principle and all of its productions fade again into a kind of sleep, which in India is called a pralaya. In this particular concept of things, the idea is that the life of a creating deity is also measured in time. This time is infinitely greater than anything that we can imagine. The life of one of these creative deities may extend into hundreds of billions of human years. Yet this being in some way emerged, not by the process of growing up as we know it, but by a parallel or equivalent process, a process of unfolding. Growth, in terms as we term the word, implies the release of potential, the gradual unfolding of a state of maturity. This also in another dimension, but in the same essential principle, accounts for the emergence of deities. Deities come forth not from nothing, but from the previousness of themselves, that awaken, as we might say, from sleep. And the intervals between the great creative cycles of a deity are referred to as intervals of sleep. And the manifestation of this deity is referred to as a day of manifestation. And the retiring of this deity into non-manifestation is called a night or a period of sleep. These together are referred to as the days and nights of Brahma. Now, in this particular pattern, of course, we are referring only to a deity, and it makes no difference whether this deity is the ruler of a solar system or the creator of a vast galaxy. All the time, deities, as expressions of the infinite, are coming into manifestation, awaking from the sleep of ages, or as one of the ancient books says, rousing themselves from the 7 nights at rest, so that there are 7 cycles of rest and 7 days of manifestation, symbolic to make up the light creating power. In emerging, therefore, this deity takes the place perhaps of some other that is fading into sleep. And as there are millions and hundreds of millions of these systems in space, in all different degrees of growth, maturity, and decline, space itself continues to be forever inhabited by creations, just as the earth is continually inhabited by creatures, although none of these creatures has a continuous existence as far as we can see or tell. This is a pretty large concept, but is almost certainly the best that we know at the present time. So to summarize the point as far as we have gone, we can simply say that space itself is like an infinite universe of existences, and that the stars and the great constellations and the great orders of life are like hosts of beings inhabiting space, subject to all the laws which in a small way man is subject to, but still like man, having this mysterious power of perpetuating the great purpose of life, although as an individual he cannot perpetuate himself physically indefinitely any more than a solar system can. All stars and planets and solar systems and galaxies must in time fade away, but as they fade, others will take their places, and the continual process will be unbroken. In the same thinking also, those that fade away do not surely or truly die. Man may fade away as far as his manifestations are concerned. His body disappears. And in the case of the universe, the great luminary, the great sun in the center of a solar system may gradually burn out. But this does not mean that the sun dies. It merely means that it retires from an objective to a subjective state again. in this great ebb and flow of the tides of life. For in the processes of creation, there must always be this duality of motion, the two motions recognized by Lao Tzu. There must be the outflowing motion and the returning motion, as in the case of the movements of tides. Now this involves then the concept of where these various deities came from in their own eternal existence. Here we then have another chain of patterns which belong to part of the concept of eternality itself. Life is an infinite progression of patterns. Life is an infinite unfoldment of infinite potential. No one can say or even imagine what the total potential of existence is. But it is assumed in philosophy of the idealistic nature that this potential, like the theological assumption of God, is infinite. Therefore, all forms of growth that ever have been are part of it. All forms of growth that now are part of it. All forms of growth that can ever possibly come into manifestation are part of it. Thus, what we would term the unfoldment of things is an infinite progression of growth, very much like a cycle of many embodiments of man, for here the ancients also made use of the concept of rebirth. That rebirth itself is an infinite process of a kind, and that this process is a continual unfoldment of life. Thus, in this universal concept, there is not only the continuance of these beings, but the unfoldment of their potential. Thus, in time, all of these beings evolve, and even what we might term the great powers creating cosmic systems are still growing, and must continue to grow. This growth began at some remote time and under some remote condition which we cannot even imagine. This growth in the end leads beyond any imaginable or conceivable state, but this does not mean that it actually ends. It is quite possible that growth finally passes to the point where there is no longer any galaxy, any physical form as we know it to represent the unfolding of a divine agent. But this simply means that as far as we are concerned, the process of growth passes beyond our conception, and therefore we assume that it ends. We assume that when the galaxy dies, it dies. But this is no more a truthful assumption than the idea that when man dies, he is dead. We are only able to estimate a certain narrow, visible area of growth, but this growth itself goes on and on and on. And it also came from a mysterious source. Now, the philosophers and mystics, faced with this enormous sense of condition, also had certain hesitation within themselves. They did not actually know how to handle the idea of anything being so completely infinite and at the same time finite. They could assume that perhaps the most advanced deities imaginable in space, even the 12 great gods of Muru themselves, could have begun at some incredible remote time to grow up as man has done, as tiny organisms upon a tiny planet somewhere, that they too may have been atoms and electrons, that they may have been minute forms of life, infinitely less than we can imagine, even like the lives that make up our own body, which we cannot really estimate. Somewhere, sometime, they may have started with an extreme humbleness of things, and go on and on and on, growing, 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 until perhaps they go past the growth of planets and suns and galaxies, and perhaps become infinitely, incredibly impressive or magnificent, so vast we can no longer even imagine them. This is all right up to a point, but it certainly ultimately gives the individual not only a sense of inferiority, but a tremendous headache. It is impossible to estimate in mental terms this infinite, inevitable, eternal growth, without again falling into the same dilemma that all things that grow must have grown from something and grow to something, and the infinite process of movement from lesser to greater provides us with so vast a landscape that it's hard to even conceive it. Supposing we say, for example, that every cell in man's body will ultimately unfold and become as great as the largest galaxy in the heavens. There is nothing to prove that this could not be true. In fact, there is much more to indicate the possibility that it is true than the assumption that we merely go down into the dust and remain there. Yet even if this is all true, growth going on beyond imaginables and incredibles seems to present us with the possibility that somewhere, sometime, there would be such an incredible amassment of these vast things that even space might be exhausted by them. There's the same problem as was theologically expressed in early Christendom as whether or not the invisible universe was large enough to take care of the souls of the dead, because the souls of the dead are so greatly outnumbering the living, and from all living things forever something pours out into the invisible. Is there any possibility that the invisible will ultimately become full? And as this now involves an added dimension of enlargement, qualitatively and quantitatively, the situation that evolution presents is almost as difficult, an infinite condition, an ultimate, in which all things are infinite, becomes rather a big problem. The philosophical people, therefore, came to the conclusion that at some point or some time, things fulfill their archetypes. That in fulfilling their archetype, for example, in the case of a creation, that the archetype of the creation is the being that created it, and that any evolution or process of growth within the area of this being ultimately caused the parts to become equal to the whole. Each creature became identical to the creating power that fashioned it. And in Indian philosophy, when this identity is reached, the creation becomes identical with the creator. The creature and the creator have no longer any interval between them, and the part sinks back again to become one with the totality. That somewhere then in the infinite of things, all divided parts are reunited in their own cause. Thus, in the very last of everything, it is the deity of the creation that evolves. And this evolution is caused by the growth of the parts of itself. And when the parts of itself have completed their own growth, then the power, the central power, has attained its maturity. And these parts become part of its own completeness, like the cells of the body become part of the completeness of man, and are no longer distinguishable from the total purpose of man himself. This was as good an answer as we may likely find. And with that, we have to be content for the moment. The Indians, the East Indians, studying the situation, therefore, reduce the matter from an infinite number of creations to which it is the same truth is applicable, to the selection of one, perhaps in this particular case a comparatively small and unimportant creation which we call a solar system. A solar system is a pattern, it is a design, it is a form, an archetype, a resident forever in the divine nature. In other words, space in all of its parts is archetypal. All things grow according to patterns. All life carries pattern intrinsic within itself. Thus a life unfolding or evolving does not become a helter-skelter mass of animations. It becomes an organism, a structure, a thing in which there are limits upon all manifestations of activity, these limitations making possible the gradual emergence of a specific form of life. We can't imagine what would happen if the life of carrots suddenly became beets, or if the life of man suddenly changed into an animal. These things are inconceivable, and there is no example of their ever occurring. This is because each life impulse carries within itself the pattern of its own unfoldment and its own development. It is forever fulfilling a pattern. It is growing up into a likeness that is eternally its own. As in the case of the flowers of the field, there may be millions of a certain type of flower, but they will all grow up into the likeness of the pattern, which is their proper natures. So that when the time comes, for example, for a solar system to manifest, the archetype of this solar system rests in the consciousness of its creating power, which in turn is only one of this great mass of evolving creative powers resident in the eternal essence itself. This power has existed before, has manifested before, has created before, but it has passed into the rest which exists between the great cosmic processes. So for a while, the area of a solar system, or where a solar system is to arise, remains placid, quiet. There is no evidence whatsoever of activity or animation within this area set aside. Then, as the ancients said, a motion or an activity begins. This activity is very much like the impregnation of a seed or the beginning of the growth of the baby chick in the eggs. There comes a time when, to use an old term, the space involved in this process curdles, that activity arises within its own essence. This activity being the re-emergence of a creating power. This re-emergence is extremely gradual and takes place over a vast period of time, millions and millions of years. But gradually and according to the laws within itself, there emerges from this space, from this area set aside, the beginning of an organized existence. And in Indian philosophy, the concept is that in the beginning, at the very start of things, what was termed the egg was fashioned. Now this egg is also found in the writings of the Gnosis of Alexandria. It is the Orphic egg of Greece. It is the mysterious Druidic egg. And of course, it is the world egg of the Hindus. Now the egg is used to symbolize this simply because man has no way of devising a better analogy. It is only a symbol. When we think of the cosmic egg, we're not thinking of the same kind you buy in a store. You are thinking, however, of a process arising in nature. That what we call this process has to do with the gradual arising of a fertile condition, a condition in which situations are taking place by means of which the evolution of a universe is possible. According to the beginning of the ancient system, at the very commencement of this great process, in which the deity who is to be a solar system is awaking from the 7 nights of rest, stooping like Vishnu upon the coils of the 7 coils of the serpent of eternity. When the time comes for this to happen, the consciousness of this being, in the Hindu might be likened to Brahma, or in the Kabbalah would be likened to Ain, the boundless, or in the Gnostic theory might be considered Ildabaoth, Lord of the Aeons, in the Nordic, Allfather. When the time comes for the manifestation of this, the fiat, or creative word, consists of an energy or a ray descending from the consciousness of the being, and this ray striking the mysterious albuminous substance of space, spreads through it, fecundates it, and sets it aside for the creation of a world. This might then be likened to the fact that it is the first step in the incarnation of a being into a body or a form. In the Greek system, the incarnation was the result of this ray causing the primary division of the two natures or ultimate conditions of space itself. Space was therefore regarded as potentially capable of sustaining two conditions, a point was also made by Pythagoras. These two conditions become the beginning of polarization, and polarization is the beginning of creation. Creation and polarization are both the beginnings of division, and as Pythagoras also said, division is the beginning of death. Consequently, embodiment, the creation moving from its eternal suspension into objectification, by its first movement, determines its own end. In other words, the moment the duality appears, the division of homogeneous existence into a polarized condition, the moment this occurs, the disintegration of this compound becomes inevitable. Two is the beginning of compound, and all compound is mortal. Therefore, all compound must be dissolved, as we find inscribed on the monument of Lord Bacon at St. Albans. This division the Greeks called ether and chaos. It represented the division primarily of that part of existence set aside for a pattern of creation and that part which was not set aside. We have in this cosmic system always to remember also that in another place in space, other universes were in various degrees of unfoldment. We are only referring now to the beginning of a particular solar system. Others already exist, others will exist, some are disappearing, but now one is coming into birth. And in this coming into birth, there is what the ancients call striving, and all existence, all life is called the son of striving. And striving represents polarity operating upon itself. And in the Gnostic and in the Greek, the action of the two principles, ether and chaos, on each other produce a motion. This motion is a whirlwind, a great turning of two currents, one affecting the other. It is like the inevitable force and the immovable object. These contrasts create motion. And motion is the beginning of creation as we know it. In the ancient Nordic odes, we find, for example, that in the beginning there were two giants, two orders of giants, frost giants and flame giants. And these two, standing one group on each side of the great cleft in space, which is the Hindu egg of Brahma, or the great womb of Meru within which creation exists. These giants, one of flames and the other of ice, hurl their flames and their ice into the abyss. And out of the strugglings, out of the strivings, out of the torturings of fire and ice, striking together, vast steam arose, great mists came and covered the surface of creation. And out of the substance of this mist was fashioned the body of Yma, the Frost King, the first of all forms. And from his form, the gods later fashioned the world. But in our more simple, less symbolic system, the concept is simply that by this creation of duality, a space, a place was set aside in eternity, and in that moment time was born, dimensions were born, durations were set up, and the inevitable incarnation of the deity itself was decreed. In the course of time, the deity established its most important point. Out of the tremendous strivings of these two, fashioning the egg, there was established a boundary. Boundary being the area, the allotment, as it was called, of space set aside for a solar system. This allotment of space in its own turn could vary. Some solar systems are much greater in size than others. But each of these is determined by the power of the creating being that begins to incarnate. The greater the power of this being, the greater the area which is set aside for it. But in the end, this area is likened to a vast globe. This globe divides space into two kinds of space. The unconditioned on the outside, which remains forever the seminal field from which other worlds can come, and the conditioned or circumscribed space within the sphere. This being now set aside and apart for the creation of a universe, or in this case a solar system. What we might more completely say would be that it is set aside as the potential body of the incarnating solar deity or solar logos. It is important to remember that in most of the ancient systems, the circumference was established before the center. This is a little difficult for us to imagine. We think of a center of life radiating, and that perhaps the extreme circumference of the radius would then become the area of the egg. Actually, however, in the old systems it was held that the circumference came first, even as in the case of the embryo. That which was first under the wall of the cell ultimately becomes the complete covering of the human body, evolution taking place within this, and always this wall, this ring pass not, constituting the circumference of the deity's space allotment. When this entire area has been permeated with the energy which this being causes to flow into it, we now have a space condition in which there is an eternal life, and we have a limited space allotment in which there is a non-eternal life force operating. This is very important to try to rationalize this situation, where it explains why in some of the older writings we are told that creation was accomplished by the gods gouging out holes in space, and that these holes became solids, that it was the opening of the empty area that became a world. What we're, I think, trying to distinguish here is that the impregnation of abstract space with the life of a deity places a restriction upon abstract space. It is no longer in its pure form. Abstract space has disappeared, so to say, into the composition of concrete space. And concrete space is mortal, durable, non-eternal. And concrete space upon which forms are to be created is less than the abstract space that preceded it. Therefore, in comparison to the original, it is more of a vacuum than a reality. Once this area, like an alchemical bottle in a laboratory experiment of some old chemist, once this material area has been set aside as a globe, a mysterious bubble floating in eternity, then we find the thought that Plato gives us pretty clearly defined, where he says the Logos impresses itself upon creation in the form of the cross. In the beginning, the Logos certainly impresses itself by assuming its position in relationship to this sphere, which is to be its incarnating vehicle. From the materials within this sphere, the body of the created solar system must be fashioned. And it must be fashioned by drawing upon the resources in the part of space which has been allotted to a procedure. In that point, then, according to Plato, the Logos impinges itself upon this sphere at the North Pole, that is, at the upper extremity of the sphere. And here it takes up its original and primary position. From this point, it begins the problem of we will say, conquering the field of its own manifestation. And according to Plato, this is accomplished first by projection from the pole of the now impregnated solar cell. And this consists of these four lines of fission which first appear, and which still also appear in development of the impregnated human ovum. Here we find the beginning of the creative process, which is an infinite fragmentation within this great sphere, but the sphere itself is never divided. We are also told, therefore, that this beginning, this first place that arises in this sphere, is the famous polar cap. It is the mysterious lotus cup crown of the great solar parent when it incarnates. It is also, in terms of solar systems, it is the imperishable island. It was the place where the powers or deities first descend, as in the story of the Book of Enoch. This polar continent is again mysteriously reflected downward through the various processes of creation until each planet has its polar continent, and in turn each form of life has the equivalent to its polar continent, including man. For the polar continent in man is at the positive extremity of his magnetic field, being the upper part of the mysterious globe of energy which encloses him and is his miniature of the solar globe. For the human being coming into incarnation first manifests by creating a globe of energy, within which its body will develop by drawing upon the various resources of nature and the magnetic fields of its parents. So this imperishable island, this point, which is the first to come and the last to go, becomes the first link between the deity itself, which is not embodied, and the creation which it intends to fashion. The creation must, like the embryonic development of man, reach a certain degree before it can be ensouled, before it can be quickened by the descent of the Logos into the vehicle which it is building. Now, in the ancient systems of mythology, and also in the Oriental systems, the deity awaking into objectivity, which is reversing its polarity. Well, actually, in Yoga and Vedanta, we realize that the so-called awaking of the deity is actually its passing into the sleep of matter, so that what we call awakening is only in terms of our own consciousness. But in order to attain creation consciousness, the being has to sacrifice the eternal consciousness of the space samadhi itself, that is, the infinite, unembodied consciousness. The samadhi, the cosmic state of consciousness, has to be lost in the process of creation. It is submerged. And the deity is beginning to submerge this consciousness in the area which it is set aside for creation. As the deity awakens objectively by going to sleep subjectively, the hierarchs which it has brought with it come into manifestation also. In man, according to the ancient belief, 7 spirits incarnate along with the sovereignty of the divine soul itself. These spirits in man take up the 7 vital functions of the body, becoming symbolically represented in the body by the 7 vital organs, as links by the 7 units of the endocrine chain, and finally by 7 mysterious points in the brain, which are called the rishi, or governors. Now, the same thing happens in the development of the solar system. The point at the north pole of the eggs, or of the magnetic field, is the Meru, or mountain of the gods, and it is from here that all of the great creative processes take place. Incidentally, there is no correspondent southern pole, for all the growth moves from the positive, And in the Hindu mythology, the Suras, or the great powers of light, work from the North Pole, but the Asuras, which are the negative principles of receptive darkness, work from the South Pole. In the development of this being, those manifestations of its own consciousness, which are primary, first come into manifestation after itself. It gradually turns creation over to these secondary powers, but the only way that it can release them is to go to sleep in them. Therefore, we have the great problem, which was oppressed theologians for thousands of years, and that is the Trinity, or the triad of creating powers in India: Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. In this particular symbolism, of course, as we know, the supreme power goes to sleep as far as its unity is concerned, and becomes aware of itself in its three creating aspects as a trinity. It has no longer the full conscious awareness of its own unity, because this unity is absorbed into three points of individualized consciousness, which constitute the triad or symbol of equilibrium. These three become the creative power. That is the power that is actually to become the beginning and ruler of all the processes of creativity. The second is to become the protective, the preservative, and the enlightening power. And the third is to become the reproductive and ultimately destructive power of crystallization or transformation, by means of which the entire pattern is prevented from ever being captured in an eternal likeness. In other words, the full power of your Creator is the power that prevents the ultimate turning of the solar system into stone and locking within it every form of life that is there. Therefore, as the processes of nature decline, then your disintegrating power breaks up the compounds. The creating power, of course, is Brahma, and in India, the preserving, protecting, and perpetuating power is Vishnu, and the power which breaks up crystallization by transformation is Shiva, the eternal mendicant, always dressed in wild garments of an ascetic, body covered with clay, sitting alone in meditation on the snowy peaks of Himavat. The principle, however, is that three agencies now take over. And these three agencies, in taking over, in turn release those hierarchs or orders of life which are locked within their consciousness. And each one, as it unlocks the powers within it, releasing orders of existence, goes to sleep in these orders of existence. Thus Vishnu, the preserver, in releasing the 10 avatars, goes to sleep in the 10 embodiments of itself. And all this process continues, in which the continuous involutionary process, by means of which the solar system is finally brought into the condition which we might recognize today, is always a process of consciousness going to sleep in embodiment, always a process of unities being broken up into diversities, always a process of a single consciousness losing its nature of identity and becoming divided consciousness. So we finally reach the nadir of this situation, the greatest possible descent of the deity into manifestation. And at that point we have the universe of infinite diversity. We have the universe in which every fragment appears to be completely isolated, in which every substance and essence has its own life and its own purpose, in which there are infinite and countless manifestations of creatures and creations, where there is no longer any communion between these creatures, except perhaps such communion as comes through instinct or intuition. We have then the universe as the solar system as we see it today. We have a solar system with countless forms of vegetation, with innumerable types of insects and fishes and birds, mammals of all kinds, flowers, trees, We have even the magnificent evolving processes in the crystallization of rocks. And we have, perhaps above them all, the mysterious power of man himself, who has also a manifestation of this infinite division of consciousness. Now, the ancients gave to the Trinity, or the basic creating triad of beings, the power to fashion out of the chaotic elements within the alchemical vessel the great formula of life itself. And this process goes on, and the medieval alchemists transformed the entire creation of the universe, the solar system, man, and the human soul into chemical equations. And the study of all these equations is a very fascinating thing, because it finally breaks down again to a highly evolved system of abstract philosophical chemistry. But for all practical purposes, we can't follow every step of the way. We know that as surely as the various powers emerge in their own development, that we will find also the emergence of the planetary system. We find that from the sovereignty of the sun's consciousness will come forth the consciousness of planets, that these planets are miniatures of the solar system, each beginning with a magnetic field within the greater field, each with its own Mount Nearer at its northern pole, each therefore producing from itself a recapitulation of the 7 continents, the 7 great oceans, the 7 orders of life, beginning with the mineral, and finally the 7 basic races of men. All of these septenaries arise from the same septenary principle that brought forth the creation of the worlds in the first place. You have your musical harmony, your chemical affinities, and all these things paralleling this ancient system in every possible respect. You may later, as time goes on, be able to refine and improve some of the minor phases of it, but the great principle involved is not likely to be changed, because man has never conceived anything since that was as stupendous and yet as logical in terms of common human experience as that which was developed by the sages of ancient India, Egypt, China, and Greece. These were the great thinkers of the primordial world of man's experience. So gradually this mysterious globe in space begins to fill. It fills in many ways. The Gnostics pointed out that gradually, as the result of this development, a new center is established. This new center, as it came into existence, was necessary in order that the physical world might be generated. This center, like the original one, is not in dead center of the egg, but above the center, but not at the outer at top, as in the case of the primordial center. In man, 3 centers are recognized as coming into existence: the heart, or spiritual core, and the brain and the reproductive system. These 3 become man's manifestation of the 3 deities. And in the creation of the solar system, these also come into manifestation. The next thing that we find is that near the center of this great circle, or sphere that we have set up, there descends from above, from the imperishable center, a new or extension of life, which moves into a central point. And in this central point, it draws from the entire area of the sphere all of the impregnated energy that is in a solar system is drawn from the circumference by a mysterious spiritual attraction until it gathers into a point near the center of the solar sphere, or the mysterious crystalline bubble in which we find the process taking place. Excuse my inadequacy in language, but some of these are rather taxing to find words for. In any event, the center having been established by privating, as Jacob Boehme calls it, privating the entire interior of the egg, everything moves to the center to cause something that resembles the yolk of the egg. In the Greek, we have the same principle in the symbolism of the shield of Helios, the sun deity. The area of the circular shield is the egg. The central boss or knob represents the condensation of the spiritual power to a center. And as the energy is all drawn to this center, what is left is called the privation. This is the part that is deprivated of life. This becomes what Damon calls the great hunger. It is that which cries for life. It is told in the Gnostic series that the great mother cried out that she might give birth. And this great mother represents the field of the egg after it has been deprived by the central energy, which moves to the center and there forms by a tremendous psychic compression the magnetic body of the sun. The sun, therefore, is the energy of the entire area set aside for a solar system. The sun becomes sovereign of that part which lies within the wall of the egg. Beyond the wall of the egg, the sun has no further sovereignty. And outside of the solar system, beyond a certain point, the sun no longer exercises any influence. It may be seen, it may be sends its own little ray across space, but it has no proprietorship over the evolutionary process. And if a ray of the sun or of some other sun in space goes forth like the ray of a fixed star which has been captured in sound and color by modern equipment, if this ray reaches out, maybe goes across 1,000 solar systems to be recorded by some instrument that we have, this ray, however, does not fertilize. It does not cause any creation in this outside area, only within its own field of manifestation. Once the central sun is therefore created, we come again to the Pythagorean and Ptolemaic theory. In their theory, the egg of the solar system was represented by a circle within which were the concentric rings of the planetary orbits. But at this time, the planetary orbits do not exist. The term we are referring to, the hypothetical boundary of the solar system, is represented by a belt of stars. Inside of this, the material is gradually drawn to the center by privation. And to indicate that, the ancients established the orbits of the planets to signify the 7 degrees of privation. The orbit of Saturn was fashioned first, being that which is the furthest from the sun, and therefore Saturn is the eldest of the gods, and he is also the god that must destroy or devour all his own creation. His orbit, being the most remote, represents, therefore, that which is the first to be fashioned, and incidentally will be the last to be compensated or overcome. And Milton says that death is the last great enemy. So that in the development of this theory, the orbits are formed by the retiring of the energy, degree by degree, towards center, producing first the orbit of Saturn, then of Jupiter, then of Mars, then the ancient concept of the orbit of the sun, which was, however, a cover for another planet which they did not know. And later, after that, the orbit of Venus and of Mercury, and the orbit of the moon, which was the closest to the earth. They had their own little private system of astronomy, but the concept is that the earth to them was the physical body corresponding to the human heart, which was set up in the midst of the planets, and around which, in this case, the sun, as a superior energy, also rotated. But in any event, the Egyptians tell us that the gathering of the 7 degrees of substance rose from the circumference to the center, leaving the orbits like the concentric rings of an onion, which the Egyptians held to be a sacred vegetable because it revealed this mystery. When the energy had all reached the sun, then, at that moment, the physical structure of the solar system was born. At that time, all energy had been contracted, and in this energy field, the solar logos came into embodiment. It was then the quickening, and from that time on, the power of the solar principle was no longer operating from outside, from above, or with a conscious, separate understanding of the creative process. It then incarnated, according to the ancients, in the sun itself, and began the great evolutionary part of its existence. Having gathered all its resources to achieve birth, it now achieved maturity of embodiment by gradually releasing these resources into the vacuum that had been left by the retirement of energy in the first place. It therefore began to fill the privation around it with energy which had passed through and been conditioned by its own consciousness. And from this came the orbits and bodies of the planets as we know them, to become the embodiments of the seven loci, or the seven vowels, or the seven Elohim of the first chapter of Genesis, who moved upon the face of the deep. Having gradually built all of this structure into a consistent pattern, we find the solar logos gradually achieving maturity, producing what we might term to be a structure in which the consciousness of the solar deity became permeating throughout the entire area. From that time on, the solar deity gradually took hold of its own body, as we do in growing up, until finally the body became a complete agent for his purpose, for the unfoldment of the various forms of life. Each form of life unfolded from a collective superior to itself. Thus, for instance, from a planetary deity unfolded all the life of the planet. From a particular group type, or racial type, or species type, unfold all of the separate manifestations of the different kingdoms of nature. They are all emanations by a completely rational process. They are all perfectly ordered and ordained. Now, the development of the solar system finally results in the emergence of a group of planets, all with their own evolving orders of life, all of them merged for the one solar principle, all of them dependent upon solar consciousness for their consciousness, solar mind for their mind, solar emotion for their emotion, and solar energy for the preservation of their bodies. All of these energies are principles, only the body is a receptacle, not a principle. So all these various energies finally become embodied, and in so doing gain ways of manifestation. When they are not embodied, they are not in manifestation. So man gains the power to perfect himself in arts and crafts and skills through the process of embodiment. And through this process he learns the particular lesson of the great solar field of which he is a part. For the solar power itself has impressed a purpose upon the entire procedure, and all creatures within that solar system are gradually moving to the fulfillment of that purpose. Now, there's one other step in this which is intriguing and a little more difficult, perhaps, but still worth making a try at in connection with this procedure. A man, at various times in his own life, experiences qualities or changes within his own nature. He finds, for example, that under certain conditions he is inclined to attempt to improve his nature. He attempts to discipline himself. He attempts to gradually integrate his own purposes. Now we have to realize that as man is born, grows up, passes through childhood, adolescence, and early maturity, and comes finally to the maximum use of his facilities, he still has something else he has to do, and that is he has to direct and dedicate his efforts to purposes that are proper and appropriate to him. Now, in the solar procedure, something of this nature occurs. It is hard to attempted to find it in such magnitudes as you would find in a solar system, but we still have the same principle involved, namely that the solar logos, or the creating power, using the entire solar system as its physical, emotional, vital, and mental organism, becomes like the compound individual, a series of bodies, a series of factors and forces. We have solar mind, and solar mind, while it is a great mind and an exalted mind, is not perfect mind. The same with all the other elements. A solar system in the great pattern of things is comparatively imperfect, and it is also even more imperfect when its ruling power has become obscured by the principles of matter. In other words, as it has descended into matter in a kind of symbolic fall, it has lost a certain amount of its own clarity, certain amount of its own internal comprehension. It must regain this inner comprehension by means of a resurrection. And this resurrection, which is the raising of the dead, is nothing more or less than the release of consciousness from the sepulchre or of matter, or of ignorance, of form, of the vibratory pattern which is closed in and limited or reduced the effectiveness of life itself. The resurrection, being the restoration of consciousness, simply means the restoring of the total consciousness of the solar being, and the equivalent in the solar being to what we would term illumination. In other words, this being restored to its own nature, restored to its own full consciousness, attains illumination, a symbolism which we find beautifully developed in the modern system of Buddhism. Here we recognize that the great powers, the Dhyana Buddhas particularly, also pass into samadhi, or pass into a state of meditation. And in this state of meditation, they also achieve an illumination. That there has to be also the awakening of the solar deity itself. This awakening is due in part to the production in nature of forms capable of releasing the higher forms of solar consciousness. Man at the present time is regarded as the creature possessing the most immediate resources for the liberation and restoration of the solar consciousness. This becomes, therefore, part of the secret rituals of the ancient mystery rites, namely, that the dying God dies in man, and that the resurrection takes place by the release of solar consciousness through man. That as fast as this consciousness is released, it is available again to the total experience, and that through this mysterious procedure, the solar being awakens, passing from its own kind of ignorance to its own kind of total enlightenment for itself. In order to achieve this, the solar being subjects its various bodies to discipline. And this is a very interesting point. Just as man, seeking enlightenment or seeking to advance in spiritual insight, must impose certain rules and regulations upon himself for the advancement of his own character and the perfection thereof. So, according to the ancient philosophies, the solar logos, having become embodied, having entered into the chaos of infinite potential, having been immersed or drowned or died in matter, as its consciousness unfolds by evolution, just as man's consciousness unfolds by the evolutionary process, it reaches the point in its development in which it recognizes the necessity of imposing self-rulership upon self. This experience, of course, is discovered, as Buddha points out, very largely to the Logos by man himself. Man is the one who experiences God's need for discipline. He is the one that realizes in a mysterious way that by discipline or by the integration of his resources, he grows or becomes greater or his consciousness, is subject to illumination. This illumination of consciousness is a release, actually, not of man's consciousness, which is only a fragment of the solar consciousness, but the release of the solar consciousness itself. Thus, every being that arrives at illumination releases a part of the solar consciousness. And the bodhisattvas, who will not accept the nirvana until the least of all creatures is illumined, represents the consciousness or realization that the perfection of the great being or deity who projected the world is achieved only when every creature in it attains liberation. When that is attained, then the being itself is liberated. Then the mysterious Prometheus, who was crucified for bringing light to man, is released from the rocky crag of Mount Caucasus. Then and then only is the resurrection of the Logos achieved. Then only is the restoration of the golden age made possible. To attain this, therefore, what happens? The individual, going out in life, seeks teaching, seeks help, and finds that something has been seeking him at the same time. This thing that has been seeking him is the great order of world saviors. This order of world saviors represents the release from within the solar deity of the powers of enlightenment which were also locked within it. For as Buddhism points out, when the great being went to sleep in the previous embodiment, it took him to sleep with it, the dedicated sages. It took him to sleep with it, the arhats, the ones who must guard the world during the intervals between Buddhas. It took him to sleep with it the bodhisattvas and the liberated ones, the dedicated ones, and also the great Buddhas of compassion. These were the spiritual force, the moral character, the insight of the solar Logos. And when it began to emerge and unfold again here, when a certain degree of evolution was attained in the structure of the solar system, these various orders of sages began to embody also. These teachers that had also slept in rest in the divine mind until a certain point of evolution was accomplished, were released by the fact that it was then proper for a man to be able to comprehend them. As unfolding mind in the solar system became capable of understanding, that which was necessary for that mind to understand was released from the divine mind. And this process kept on and keeps on continuously. For within the hierarchy of the solar Logos must rest all of the forces and powers actually required to achieve the ultimate liberation of the Logos. If such were not the case, then the power of crystallization would take over, and we would have dead ends. We would have things that can never go anywhere. But always in the divine nature there can be no dead end. For that which is actually the solar consciousness in its fullness is capable at all times of absolutely controlling or determining the ends of its own creation process. But this controlling power is not available at all times. It is not available until it is released gradually through the evolution of creatures. But this evolution is inevitable. Therefore, as time goes on, the problems get more complicated because faculties and natures become more complicated. But always with this complication, the faculties become richer in their power to comprehend, and more to comprehend is released in the form of the incarnation of these hierarchs of teachers. So that actually the government of the solar system is entrusted really to three forces. It is entrusted to three powers which are expressions of the consciousness of the Logos. It is entrusted first to the Manus, the great lawgivers. The lawgivers being the exactitude of the solar mind. The solar mind in the beginning, when it first contemplated absorption into creation, trusted its entire future upon the laws. These laws were a mysterious network of inevitables. These inevitables extended throughout all space, far beyond solar systems and galaxies and cosmic orders. These laws were the very laws of the substances of space which consciousness must work with. Therefore, when the great power went to sleep, it went to sleep in the law. It went to sleep with a perfect certainty that the tides of eternity would bring it finally back again to its natural estate. There could be no doubt of this. It had absolute and complete faith, because this faith was grounded in these eternal principles. And to these eternal principles it turned over the administration of itself during its ages of sleep. And these principles became its unconscious leaders. They became its inevitable will guardians. They were the will powers of deity. And these were the great and inevitable lawgivers. Then the second order of protection that was given was what has been called the Lords of the Heart Doctrine. The Lords of the Heart Doctrine represented the entire gamut of human idealistic conception. All religions, all ideals, all hopes, all faiths, all beauties, all of the creative arts, everything that inevitably must lead to the perfection of human insight in terms of faith and adoration, beauty, veneration, respect. All of these powers were invested in the Lords of the Heart Doctrine, who were the ones that became the shepherds of men. They were the ones who had to administer love before there were hearts to fear it. They were the ones who had to bring out of the growth of things in their strivings and their struggles and in the terrible chemistries of space, had to finally bring forth natural and kindly regards. From them also came the great patient teachers of human benevolence, the saints and the martyrs, all who gave all of themselves by an instinct which they cannot completely rationalize to the service of mankind. But all such dedicated persons are actually seed lives that were carried over by the Logos at the time it took on embodiment. They were not all fashioned here, but some were fashioned here. And in Buddhism they are differentiated into two orders, therefore, the celestial bodhisattvas and the terrestrial bodhisattvas. The celestial bodhisattvas are the teachers that were brought over from the previous cycle. The terrestrial bodhisattvas, the dedicated disciples who rose here to carry on the work of these teachers. And these two orders work together. As soon as the terrestrial powers, or bodhisattvas, become strong enough, the celestial ones will retire from operation, but only when the world is able psychically, emotionally, and spiritually, and aesthetically, and culturally to sustain itself. The third order of the protectors and so forth were the basis of the scientific and civil administrative powers of mankind. These saints and the seers, these also were carried over. There are orders of intellects that were derived from other patterns of life, such as the great philosophers, also the great scientists. And one of the reasons why evolution, we pass from one age to another, is because as we evolve, waves of life that have been held in suspension until the environment for them was appropriate come in and contribute their part to the direction of the entire pattern. This coming in of lives that have previously not been present merely means a calling upon other resources within the nature of the solar power itself. All of these principles are within that solar power. All of them are tied into the creation process by the impregnation of space within the sphere of solar creation. All of them were parts of the solar nature, just as all energies in life are part of the wealth which we receive from the sun. And as the symbolism of the sun shows nourishment to all things according to their needs, so these some nourishment principles become embodied as the various deities of the ancient pantheons and the ancient philosophical systems. This is the reason for the elaborate structure of the Shingon mandalas in Japanese Buddhism. These thousands of deities, and in some instances tens of thousands of deities, all represent nothing but the individualization of the energy of the sun. They are all manifestations of some quality of Dainichi Nyori or the great Buddha Virukana. Actually, therefore, just as every color that we see comes from the sun's light, just as every flavor that we can taste, every odor that we smell, everything that we touch is only a form of sun energy or sun structure. So actually, according to this philosophy, these germinal rays of the sun, forever pouring into the abyss or the vacuum to fill it, will be represented by not only faculties or powers or circumstances or growths, but also as spiritual living beings. They represent the created energies as specialized beings. In the ancient system, there was no energy that was not embodied in something. There was no mere electricity flying through space from the sun to some human being or to some other structure. All this energy was in the form of hierarchs. It was in the form of evolving lives that were the particular channels of this energy. And these evolving lives brought the energies into manifestation with them, held them in manifestation, and finally, when their purposes are finished, these energies are withdrawn, and these hierarchies retire again into the eternal nature. In the illumination of Buddha, we find the symbolism of the great teacher surrounded by the hierarchs. We find him in the presence of all the Buddhas of previous cycles. We find him attended by celestial beings. And in the lotus of the law, which is the great Mahayana scripture, we find an audience composed even of friendly and kindly associates who for the great enlightenment have come in from other solar systems to be present, not to interfere, but to rejoice in the fact that a great circumstance is occurring in nature, that a great power is being released in the evolution of things, and these gatherings for the release of great good may be considered sort of solar or cosmic holidays. They are those when all the universe rejoices, inasmuch as another phase of the great consciousness of Dainichi Nyori has been released into manifestation. When all this evolutionary process has reached a certain degree of unfoldment, little by little our lives begin to flow back again into the consciousness of the cause. Their outflowing was to lose consciousness, to become unaware of their source, therefore to wander in darkness until the life and character in themselves, longing for reunion with reality, impel them to begin the arduous journey to self-enlightenment. But in the great motion back in evolution in the solar system is simply a continuous process of awakening. It is a process of lives becoming more and more conscious of realities. And as the highest solar reality is the Logos, or the power at the source of solar existence, as all the parts of the solar system become aware of this, they return to it, which is, of course, underline the Buddhist concept of the parinirvana. For the parinirvana is simply the hierarchies returning home to the great spiritual orders to which they belong, as we also see in the magnificent spectacle of the hierarchs on the petals of the great rose in Dante's Paradiso. Actually, all these hierarchies returning home restore the consciousness of the Solar Logos in Shingon Gainichi Nyori. When they have all come back, when all divided consciousness has experienced again unity, when all divided parts have been drawn together in the indissoluble bonds of insight, the energies slowly become again what they were in the beginning. They retire from the many to the 12, from the 12 to the 7 to the 3, and the 3 return again to the 1. And when they have all returned again to the 1, the solar system has completed a lifetime. At that time, having regained its consciousness, enriched by the tremendous pageantry of growth which has occurred within it during its cycle, the Solar Logos awakens from embodiment. It is released from body as man is released from body. But as man, according to the ancient mysteries, may be released in two ways. We have the same principle involved in this. There is a form of death in which the body is separated from the soul. And there is also a form of death in which the soul, rising, separates itself from the body. And in the philosophical mystery, the return of these conscious powers under the dedication of discipline, the transformation of men and creatures into avatars, into arhats, into sages. All this means the gradual return of life as consciousness, becoming more and more aware both of itself and of its great overlife. Finally, they all come together again in the consciousness of Dainichi. Then the globe and all that it inhabits disappears. Then the rings go back. Everything slowly reverses itself until nothing remains again but the imperishable island, floating upon the surface of unconditioned space. Then at last this imperishable island does not perish, but vanishes into subjectivity, where it remains until the next cycle of embodiment is proper and natural. The Logos then goes to sleep again for the 7 eternities. This is going on constantly in space, according to the ancients. In Buddhist philosophy, the Buddhas and the great principles, the spiritual powers, of tens of thousands of myriads of universes attend in the great rejoicing when one of the solar systems is completed and one of these great cycles comes to an end. But this cycle again is of course part of a larger one. The solar deity, in passing into sleep, contributes to the evolution of the universal deity around whose nature many solar systems rotate. And the universal deity in turn, with all its solar systems and all its parts, is part of a galaxy or a still greater pattern, which again is reaffirming itself. But as all these things are continually reaffirming, the ancients held that in the ultimate or in the final nature of things, which is utterly beyond our conception, inconceivable to us, that everything consists finally of evolution causing things to wake up, and that ultimately the total experience of everything is therefore to be total, to be aware, to wake up, and in this awaking, to wake up as infinity, to wake up as pure divine consciousness, to wake up as the administrator or the ruler of the great sea of space, and after having awakened, to take on again in some way the dream of illusion in order to advance other areas, other factors. For as surely as illumination is eternal and inevitable, so that those elements or patterns which are created are likewise eternal and innumerable. And we have to also realize that at various stages in this procedure, living things themselves become seminal. That is, they become seeds. And at certain periods of their development, the creatures of the various hierarchies bring new ways of life or new sparks of life into manifestation, which must go through the great cycle in space. We may agree with the Brahmins and we may agree with the Buddhists that it's all very abstract. We must agree with them that we do not have the answers to the infinites. But I think it is interesting to conceive as far as we can go the majesty of this concept, a concept which it seems to me, by some mysterious and wonderful grasp of insight, transcends the noblest and most extravagant fantasies of science, transcends anything that we can imagine, for it not only gives us this infinite majesty of purpose, it gives us the infinite scientific unfoldment of things under law and under consciousness, but it also preserves a tremendous pattern of divine purposes, of great spiritual beings and great spiritual centers of consciousness, constantly and inevitably fulfilling their proper destinies in space. It is a very large concept. Naturally, we cannot grasp it all, but the small fragment that has been grasped has become the basis of most of the world's enlightened philosophies, and has stood the test of human experience better than any system upon a less substantial foundation. And so with this perhaps as a basis, we can proceed to further phases of the ancient concepts of creation as they are found in the old teachings. Well, I think that's enough for this evening, and thank you very much.